Round.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you, Arthur, for inviting me to have a little chat. And that's all this will be, is a little chat about ringing. And it's not about, I'm not going to give you a lecture on the history of Birmingham ringing, because certainly I'm not qualified to do that. But what I can tell you about is my ringing history and my involvement, which is largely in Birmingham, of course, and some of the people I met along the way, and perhaps one or two little interesting stories that you might find them not interesting, but I find them quite interesting about some of the ringers that I'd met. Now, I talked with Arthur about how to tackle this, and we both agreed that the sensible way is to go chronologically, and that makes sense. Although, having said that, I'm afraid that there's enormous overlaps from the various parts of the sort of things I would talk about. So I will do my best to keep you informed on where I am in the date, as it were, and jump backwards and forwards, and that's the way it's going to be, I'm afraid. So where do we start? We'll start at the beginning. Where was I born? I was born in Erdington. So I'm a Brummie, a real Brummie. I was born before the war in a terrace property in Erdington. Now, some of you will know about terrace properties because there are some back-to-backs in Birmingham, run by the National Trust, which hopefully some of you have seen. And I was born in a house similar to that. It wasn't quite like that. It wasn't. We didn't have to share a loo. It was an outside loo, and there was an outside coal house. So I wasn't born with a silver spoon from that point of view. I had a fairly difficult childhood. Yes, I was born before the war. So the first thing I remember really was air raid warnings. Not many of you are going to be old enough to remember that, but those that do remember it will never forget it. It's one of those things that you never forget, the air raid warning siren. And what happened then was, well, I was a very small child, of course. My mother would grab me and wrap me up in a blanket, run down the garden, and put me in the Anderson shelter. Everybody those days had an Anderson shelter, named after me, of course. But these shelters were, for those of you that don't know, were made of corrugated iron generally, were semicircular on the top and buried in the ground and covered in earth. So the idea was that if a bomb dropped or close by, you would be protected totally from it. If you got a direct hit, that was tough. So the air raid shelter. So mother would drop me in the air raid shelter, 4 bunks, 2 on each side. And it always smelled of paraffin. It's another thing you never forget. It's the smell of paraffin and damp in those shelters. It wasn't the most pleasant place, but I was only little and I didn't know. And then she'd rush upstairs and grab my little sister, who was a baby at the time, and bring her down. And the one thing I do remember, we had air raids, of course, and the siren goes, you rush down to the shelter, you get in the shelter, and then the bombing starts. And what you hear is the planes overhead, and boom, 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 as the bombs drop. Now, after a while, the Germans stopped dropping big bombs in our area, and certainly they were trying to target ICI Kynoch at Witten, where ammunition was made and so on. That was their principal target. and we were close to that in Erdington. The bombing would start, and the Germans decided that one of the best ways to upset the British was to drop incendiary bombs. Now, you may have heard of these. They're actually only small bombs, you know, just a few inches in diameter, but there were thousands of them. Each plane would drop 1,000 bombs at least. And these bombs, once they hit their targets, exploded and threw fire-raising stuff like napalm was one of the constituents. And they would throw this stuff all over the properties. And of course, there were fires everywhere. And I remember as a small child that the house next door was hit. And my mother got out of the shelter. My father was on ARP duty, air raid precaution duty. He was in an occupied, no, what's the word? An occupation that didn't have to go in the forces because he was building Spitfires at Castle Bromwich. So he was on ARP duty, and he was trying to fight this fire in next door's house. And my mother suddenly jumped out of the shelter and went to help him. And that gave me the opportunity to peep outside and see what was happening. And this is a sight I will never forget. You look up to the sky and you can hear the planes, and there are searchlights, beams of light looking for these planes everywhere. And then there are guns going boom, 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 trying to shoot down these planes. That sort of thing you never forget as a child, you know. That was very interesting. The rest of my childhood was not very interesting. In fact, it was pretty unpleasant, really. My father used to go out drinking every night. And when he came home, occasionally he beat my mother up. And when I was big enough, I used to try and join in. And one morning, I got up to go, I don't know whether it was school or what, but I got up to go and my mother was missing. My father was there. Now, he would normally have been at work. So what's gone wrong? And the answer is, she'd left him. She'd gone. And it took me quite some time to find out. My father wouldn't tell me where she'd gone, but I did eventually find out that she'd gone to the sister and brothers in Perry Common. So my sister and I, toddlers, walked off to Perry Common and went to my aunt and uncle's house. And there we lived, actually, for more or less the next 10 years. It was very cramped, incredibly cramped. And I remember my uncle had a room to himself. I had a room to myself, but all the ladies had to sleep in one room. So it wasn't, I didn't have the best start in life, let's put it like that. So you don't want to hear about all that, do you? You want to actually hear about ringing. Well, that started when I was at technical school with Brian Downing. Now, I didn't know. Brian was messing around with, he seemed to be working all the time. And we were in a lesson that was utterly boring, of course. And he was working away. And at the end of this lesson, I said, Brian, are you taking notes about all this? And he said, no. So I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm working out ringing changes. What? Ringing changes? What's that about? So he began to explain to me about bell ringing and so on. And I sort of took that in. But for whatever reason, it stayed in my mind. And a few days later, I said, "Where do you do this business, this rigging business?" I was quite interested. And he said, "At Aston, why don't you come along and have a look? You know, you don't have to do anything. You just come and have a look." And what am I, 15, 16? I'm interested. So off we go. One Thursday night to ringing practice at Aston. And that was it, really. They invited me to have a go, of course, as inevitably you would. And the ringing master there was Edric Franklin, and he taught me to ring. And that was an interesting start, really, which was quite important. He handed the rope to me to start with and said, "Take that rope." So I'm right-handed, so I took it in my right hand, of course. And he taught me to ring with my rope in my right hand and my left hand on top. and that's the way I learned. And I also learned very, very quickly. We had at Aston, we had the two trebles were tied. So I could ring these any one of these bells at any time during the practice. You know, most people in those days only got, you know, it's the learner's practice, 10 minutes or whatever it was. And that's all you got. But I was able to ring all the time during the practice. Once I learned to handle a bell, of course, and got the thing under control. And I was also able to follow people change ringing. So I learned such an enormous amount in a very short space of time. And it wasn't long before I began to, in a sense, outgrow the band at Aston. They only had 4 or 5 ringers or something like that. And they weren't very experienced. Alan Short was the most experienced, and occasionally we had visits from Dick Ingram, who was the ringing master at Perry Bar at the time. And he was a more of a competent conductor. But Alan Short had rung with good people in Birmingham, so he was an experienced ringer, but the rest were not very experienced at all. So that's how I started. Then I began to move around to other practices. So I was now able to handle a bell, and you know, I wasn't such a menace as I might have been. And the first place I went to was Erdington Parish. Erdington Parish Church at that time had an influx of girls. And I remember, sort of thing you never forget, I remember climbing into the ringing chamber at Erdington Parish. I don't know whether it's still the same, but you used to come up through a trap door. And I'd go up through this trap door and look around, and all I could see, I remember I'm 15 or 16, girls' legs. I was hooked for life, wasn't I? There's no way I could have given up ringing then. Actually, I did chase quite a few of them and got on quite well with the odd one. So that was an interesting. Handsworth as well. I used to go to Handsworth practice, and the people I met there were, well, I think the tower captain was Ian Thompson at the time, who's now in Aldsley. I think he still rings in Aldsley, Coventry area. And who else was there? Andrew Stubbs, of course. Andrew Stubbs. I always remember Andrew Stubbs. He was always sitting in the corner doing his homework. Me, having virtually no education, couldn't understand what this was all about, and why couldn't he join in and have a lot of fun like me? But Andrew was obviously his life paid him dividends. Oxbridge and so on. And there was Diana Perrins, lovely girl, bit older than me, and Liz Yardley, who was my age. And those are the sort of ringers that I rang with in Handsworth. Now, the other thing I did at about this time, remember I'm 17 now, something like that, 18. Where are we? 1950, 55. Easter 55, I started to learn to ring. And by 56, I was doing quite a bit. And I was ringing quite a lot with the Walsall ringers. But the reason I was doing that is that when I was about 16, Stella Hughes, who was the daughter of the tower captain at St Matthew's, Walsall, 12 Bell Tower, organised a cycling tour for young people. And I met on that tour, there were about a dozen of us, people all about my age, who were all kids together. Yeah, well, we didn't think we were kids, of course, we're big adults and so on. So we went on this cycling tour around Hereford, and I made some wonderful lifelong friends. Ian Holland is a lifelong friend of mine. In fact, I spoke to him a couple of months ago to see how he was getting on. He lives over in East Anglia somewhere. And anyway, Stella Hughes organised all of this, and we had this lovely tour in Hereford, cycling, and it was great fun. I remember Ian and I were cycling together once, and we were way ahead of everybody else, and we weren't due at the next tower for about half an hour. And we suddenly saw this sign in a farmyard saying cider available. So I said, "Do you fancy it?" In we went, and we had a glass of this cider, which you got through the kitchen door. It wasn't a bar or anything like that. It was just handed through the window. So we had a pint of this cider, and we liked it. We did enjoy it. So we had another one. Anyway, we then got on our bikes to ride down the farmyard and out of the gate. And within about 30 yards, we both fell off, stoned, as it were. And that was the first time I did have that much alcohol, but it was something that you never forget. So that was Stella Hughes. Was an interesting girl. She was still at school in the very early meeting days, and she could call peals. She called a lot of my peals in my early peals, and she could also compose peals, and she composed peals of Stedman Caters and Stedman Sinks and things, all sorts of things like that. So she was a very competent person. And I was very friendly with her. And I used to go to Walsall practice pretty frequently, and I'd finish work. I think I was serving in an apprenticeship at that time. And I'd finish work and I'd get on my bike and ride over to Walsall. Never thought any more about distance in those days. You got on your bike, that's what you did. And I used to go over to Walsall and call it Stella's house for their, I think it was a Wednesday practice, I can't remember now. And her mother looked after me, something wonderful, absolutely. She gave me everything. What would you like? And tea was all laid on, and it was really, really good. I don't know whether she actually had thoughts about me and Stella, but that didn't actually ever work out. But I'd love to see her again, and she must be, well, pretty well my age, 80 something. and she was a great person. Now the other people that were around at that time um, were little Tommy Dutton always rang the ninth, or was it the eighth? I can't remember now. Little Tommy Dutton, he was only a tiny little guy. Jimmy Eastwood was there. Chris Wallater was the tower captain at. Oh, it'll come to me. Howard Howell was the principal conductor, and so on. Ernie Stitch was another guy who rang there quite a lot. I'm not entirely sure whether he was a member of that group, but occasionally Jack Pittman would be there as well. Now Pittman, as probably Albert J. Pittman is probably pretty well known, and in fact. We've been reading some articles about Pittman. I mean, I wasn't as aware as perhaps I should have been as to his credentials and the wonderful things that he was doing in terms of composition. But I was aware that he was a crap handler. He wasn't. He was terrible. He could hang anybody. So that was my recollection of Pittman. They can say what they like about his brain. There's no doubt his physical abilities were not particularly good. So that was Walsall. So then there was, of course, I mean, by that time, as I'd mentioned, I'd pretty well outgrown the Aston band. And I was very ambitious as far as ringing was concerned, and relatively able, I suppose. And I started going to St Martin's. And needless to say that the people at St Martin's were no fools. They recognised that a 16-year-old lad who was keen and able was something that was desirable. So they encouraged me to ring at St Martin's, and very early on in the situation, I was about third or fourth visit I'd been there. Henry Fern sidled up to me, as Henry would sidle up to people, and say, "Hey, you'll never learn to ring like that." What do you mean, Henry? He said, "You can't ring left over right. You can't do it." I thought, a load of crap, you know. What's that mean? A load of nonsense, arrogant 16, 17-year-old, you know. I know just as well as you. So I thought about it during the week, and he didn't give me any good reason other than it didn't look right. And I thought, well, what sort of bloody reason is that? You know, it's not very important. However, during the week, I thought, well, if I want to join this lot, if I'm keen to be involved, I've got to listen to what they say. And during the week, I switched over to right over left. And I mean, there are good reasons for doing that now, I recognise, as a person that's taught a lot of people to ring, that you really do, if you are right-handed, which I am, you do really need your right hand on the top, the strongest hand on the top, and I preach that at the moment. But so next Sunday morning, I turn up at St Martin's, ringing right over left, and Henry sidled up again and said, "Hey, that's better." So I was pretty well then accepted into the band at St Martin's, and that would have been, I suppose, towards the end of '56. Yeah, I think it was about September of '56, something like that. So who was ringing there at that time? Now that's interesting. Well, basically the Baldies. We called them the Baldies because nearly all of the band, for whatever reason, was bald. So let's start off from the biggest bell, Bill Froggatt. Now, Bill Froggatt was about 6'4", 6'5" in stature and big with it. He used to ring the tenor as he used to pull from ceiling to floor. He was an incredible strong man. And we all used to say, God, if ever he misses the Sally, it'll finish up over the road in Woolworth. The bell will, rather. So he used to ring the tenor, and that's all he did ring. That's not true. That's not true. I remember the odd practice night when Albert Walker, and I'll tell you about Albert in a minute, but he was the boss. Albert Walker decided that he was going to have a bit of fun. So he'd asked Bill Froggatt, Bill, ring the 11th to grant the triples. So Bill would get on the 11th and have a go at playing hunting, and he wasn't very good at it. And Albert, in his impish way, and I'll tell you a bit more about him in a minute, let him get to the back, and then he'd say, Bill, lead, Bill. And the whole tower would bend as Bill heaved this bell into position. So that was Bill Froggatt, and he used to ring the tenor. On the 11th, there was usually either mostly George Fern, Henry Fern, maybe, and so on. But if we move around, we'd got George Chaplin on the 10th. George Chaplin always rang the 10th. Edward T. Lloyd always rang the 9th. Now those two, always rang those two bells, never anywhere else. And they expected to have a bob at 1. Most of the touches of Stedman in those days started with a bob at 1. And if there wasn't going to be a bob at 1, you'd have to tell them. Otherwise, you get a bob at 1, regardless. So they were quite two characters, those two. Coming around, Jack Pinfold. Jack Pinfold was the guild ringing master at the time, and a nice sort of guy. He played bowls actually, and I'll talk about bowls a bit later. The thing about Jack was he never made a mistake. He never made a mistake. Well, that's not true. If Jack made a mistake, that was the end of it. You're never going to get Jack right. So he's obviously his brain scrambled as soon as he got lost, and he couldn't. Nobody could ever put him right. So I rang a lot of pills with Jack. Umpteen pills of London, and no way did he make any mistakes at all. For many, many years, he didn't make a mistake in a peel. If he did, you lost it. It was as simple as that, really. Coming round, who have we got left? I have to look at my notes here because I can't remember everybody. On the treble, we'll go switch right round to the treble. We had Percy Richards. Now, one of the problems that Albert had was after the war, the band was very much depleted, and he drew in people from all over the place. And George Chaplin had come from Tamworth, Edward T. Lloyd from Shirley, and Brian Woolley from Walsall, and Percy Richards from Stourbridge. And Percy rang the treble. He only ever rang the treble. In fact, Albert would only ever let him ring the treble. And Percy never got above 6, 7 without going wrong. So it was a question of go Stedman, and after about 3 or 4 minutes, he'd say, Percy this, Percy that, Percy that, stand. And that was the end of the Percy Richards touch, it was called. Now, Ralph Edwards, who was a competent ringer from Cheshire, was a member of the band at that time, and he used to say, "Hey, I'm not coming till after the Percy Richards touch," and he wouldn't turn up until about 10:20 or something like that, when the Percy Richards touch had fired out. So. Who else was there? A few others left. Sid Holloway, of course. Sid was a chemist, a pharmacist from Smethwick, and he was a pretty good ringer, competent ringer. So anywhere around the front end. Frank Haynes, the sort of deputy. I don't think he ever had that title, but. That's what he was. He used to do quite a lot of the conducting. He was one of the able conductors. Frank Haynes. Who else have we got? Muriel, of course. Muriel, the only woman in the band when I first started there. Muriel was, I suppose, 10 years or more older than me, something like that. At least that much. And she was the only lady in the band, and Bill Froggatt disliked having women in the band, and made it pretty clear, you know, he wouldn't have anything to do with Muriel. He wouldn't speak to her or anything like that. Strange people, really, some of them. Then who had we got? Ralph, I've mentioned. Ralph Edwards is a pretty competent ringer and liked to ring tenors quite a bit, and he was quite good. So you've got sort of half a band of decent ringers and half a band of not too competent, shall we say. So the ringing was nowhere near as good as it is today. Let's put it like that. How it compared with others, I'm not at all sure. We also had quite a lot of visits from Frank Smallwood, who had been a Birmingham ringer and was living in London. And any time that he was in the area, he would come and ring. And Frank Perrins as well, who was a Coventry ringer. Both of those two people were prominent on the Central Council, so they were involved there. And a bit later, the band was joined by Charlie Webb and Francis Dodds. Those were two, and there were quite a few, of course, after that. But that's where we were. Yes. Now then, where was I then? Yeah, we lived with my aunt and uncle and this is where I switch backwards and forward. My aunt and uncle for maybe 10 years, something like that, and then, I mean, it just got very difficult to live there anymore. We filled the place, and you know, we needed to get move on, and we did. My mother and my sister went to live in a house in Handsworth, and that left me floating and looking for somewhere to go. Well, as it happened, there were two other lads looking for somewhere to go who'd just come to Birmingham to ring. Well, not to ring, to work actually, but they were ringers, and the three of us got a flat in Handsworth. This flat is fairly notorious, so I won't go into too much detail on what happened at this flat. But we all had girlfriends, let's put it like that. I'd met Janice by this time, and the other guy, Barry Hendry, had a friend, Pat, and David Purnell had a friend called Audrey. So we had friends. But one of the problems of living in a flat with three blokes like that is that you all have to do your bit. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. And we lived, it was a top story, I think 3-story building, Somerset Road, I think. Lovely, nice place, nice place. The landlady was German. She had a lovely daughter, a bit young, but highly, very nice. And we didn't exactly cover ourselves in glory in terms of looking after the place, in fairness. One of us, who shall remain nameless, didn't really do their chores. So the washing up, stacked up in the sink and so on. And beds were never made and all sorts of things like that. And anyway, this landlady called us together once and she said, your beds are never made. And Barry Henry immediately chipped in and said, oh, that's the way we do it in Britain, And she then I thought, oh yes, I'm not having that. So she chucked us out on the street, bang, out straight through the front door and out into the street with all our stuff. And we all found our own way just wherever after that. So that was an interesting aside, really. What else was I doing? How are we doing?
Ringing peals at the cathedral, John.
Pardon?
When did you start ringing peals at the cathedral?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was just trying to get it in order. Cathedral peals, yes, of course. I started ringing peals very early at the cathedral. We used to ring at Bishop Ryder's as well. Bishop Ryder's is now where Aston University campus is, and Bishop Ryder's was a super peal of bells. And the church was derelict. We used to go there and get the key off the caretaker. George was in charge, of course. George Fern organised nearly all of the ringing in Birmingham at that time. He was a great organiser. There's no question about that. And he organised all these peals on a Thursday night at the cathedral as well. So we had the two of them going. Once the cathedral was out of action for quite a few years, until about probably 1960, I would think, something like that. But once it was back in action, we started ringing peals at the cathedral. Bishop Ryder's, we go there on a Monday night, every Monday night, and we'd get the key, in we'd go, and as the time went by, things got more and more difficult there. The buildings closed, things are getting rickety, the roof's beginning to leak. And I remember ringing peals there with water running, with electric lamp in the middle of the room, but a bare bulb. And I remember ringing there with water running down the cable and sizzling. and the floor was often flooded. The water had got in, and Jack Pinpole would say, George, I'm not going to ring in the deep end tonight. And he used to bring a stack of newspapers to stand on. And then the light went altogether. And we had an oil lamp for a bit. And I remember somebody broke a stay. And we then rang quite a few peals without a stay on the treble. I remember that, and in the dark pretty well. So it wasn't. It was, but we rang some very good peals. In fact, I do recall one of the peals that we rang there was a new method. I can't remember what it was called now, but And I had been ringing with the Lichfield Ringers in a band towards Cheshire with a conductor called Fred Grocott. Now, Fred Grocott was a very clever conductor, and he used to ring by place notation. He knew where everybody was by place notation. And being a young, receptive sort of guy, I thought, what a good idea. You don't have to learn blue lines or anything like that. All you need is a place notation. So I practiced this, learning, and you can do it. There's no, it isn't all that difficult. I practiced this by ringing by place notation only, and found it not too difficult. So we start off with this peal in a new method. So I knew the place notation, and that's all I knew. So we started off with this peal. Peter was calling it, I can't remember where from, but after about an hour, I got lost. And Peter couldn't put me right, of course. He knew where I was, but he was telling me in his language, 4, 5, whatever it was, 7 places and all that. And it didn't mean anything to me. I needed the place notation. Oh dear. So up it went, up the spout, this peal went. And he said, what the hell was all that about? Why didn't you do what I told you? And I said, well, I only knew the place notation. He said, you only learnt the place notation, nothing else. No, I didn't think I needed anything else. My boy, he says, my boy, you really need to learn a lot more than that about ringing. So I got a right telling off from Peter on that one. Oh, that was Bishop Riders, wasn't it? Cathedral, yes. The cathedral. Now, the cathedral ringing was largely, in my opinion, the foundation of Birmingham ringing as it is now, i.e. at the top of the pile, as you might argue with that. But I think we've got some pretty good ringers in Birmingham. And a lot of that has come from those Thursday night peals. We had pretty well the same band most Thursday nights. Now, whilst that had a benefit and a drawback, the thing about the benefit was that you all rang together, you got to know each other, and you could get better and better. And we did actually ring some cracking peals, some really good stuff. Now, the drawback was that we're all at work. It's late on a Thursday night. Inevitably, out of 12 people, somebody is going to be thinking about work or not being able to concentrate properly. So that did cause some problems. But generally, the cathedral ringing was very good. And of course, we were ringing at that time fairly advanced stuff, Londinium stuff, mostly London stuff, and it was largely the same band. What else can I tell you about the cathedral? Not a lot. Only the other thing about Birmingham ringing was the conductors. Today, there are a proliferation of superconductors in the St Martin's band anyway. Some of the best conductors in the country are there. So, if you're ringing with that lot, you can almost forget what conducting was about. But in the early days, conducting was absolutely crucial. I mean, you weren't going to get a peal if you hadn't got somebody that knew what it was all about. And George Fern didn't know what it was all about. Basically, he called the bobs, no question about that. He knew where the bobs were, and he knew where the part ends were. But anything that happened in between was random. We often lost the peel. So his really fallback conductor was a guy called Arthur Pearson, Skinny P, as Peter Border used to call him. He was needless to say skinny, a little guy, Skinny P. Yeah. No, he could call quite a lot, and he got a pretty good idea of what was going on. So that was a bit more towards conducting. And then, of course, on the scene came Peter Border, came to work in Coventry for Armstrong Whitworth, I think, at the time. He was a ballistics expert. He became a ballistics expert. He was a mathematician, of course. Now, Peter was a step up from all of what had gone before, and he was able to call peals from any bell. In fact, Ralph Edwards used to say that he was the most complete ringer in England, and he said he can turn up, he can splice a rope, he can help to rehang a bell. He can ring any bell in the tower, no matter what the weight is, and he can call it from anywhere. The most complete ringer, arguably, but that's what Ralph Edwards said. And he was when he came along, things changed quite a bit, and we were beginning to ring more complex stuff. And then, of course, Rod Pipe came along as well. He was Rod was a pretty in his early conducting days. He was very sharp, and people didn't like that very much. You know, I mean, we hadn't got used to people putting us right for a start. And you know, as soon as you made a mistake, bang, he got you. And it didn't take him long to find out, after particularly Jack Pinfold used to say, I'm not going to ring if he's going to shout at me, and so on. So Rod was, of course, an exceptional conductor, absolutely incredible. When we were ringing these, started ringing Orion, he and Peter devised that method. I think Rod devised the work above the treble and Peter the work below. I think that's the way it was. And they developed this suite of methods. And the first one they called Orion, which covered the suite of stars. And when we first started ringing that, I remember we went to the cathedral. We attempted. I think we started for a peal. I don't know, but we had a go, and we rang about 2 leads, something like that, and it just fired out with Rod bawling his head off all the time. And I do recall that he was so competent that 4 or 5 people could go wrong at the same time in this Orion, and he could put them all right. You know, he knew where everybody was. He was a very, very good, and certainly the best conductor I've ever been involved with. And I've been involved with quite a few, actually, when I think about it. Where are we now? How are we doing? We're getting near time, aren't we?
John, before there's a question came in, and obviously I'm really keen to hear about your experience at the Guild as well. But John and Steph have asked, and it's a rumour that I asked you about actually when we were talking before. Is it true that it used to be the first 12 there on a Thursday night that used to be in the Peel?
Yeah, well, it was a bit like that, yes. George Fern, great organiser as he was, actually did organise 2 completely different bands, except himself, at Bishop Ryder's. And we both 15 ringers turned up to ring a peal at Bishop Ryder's one night. So that's the way it was. It could anything could happen, and of course Thursday night was a regular occurrence. So you got the regular people, and it could well be that people who had said they couldn't go suddenly thought they could and just turned up. There was always a Henry Fern slinking around in the churchyard and standing behind gravestones and watching to see who turned up, on the basis that he was reserved as far as George was concerned. Henry, you ring. Henry didn't like ringing very much at all. Henry liked to be in the pub with friends, chatting about things. What were you asking me? I've forgotten.
That's it. And then I'm particularly interested, as you'd expect, to hear about your experiences in the guild. I know you've had obviously a long-standing experience of guild membership and leading the guild.
The guild, yes, was interesting. I as part of my job, I was moved to Scotland. I was doing quite well at the time in this, and I was asked to head up a research team in a job in Scotland, and that job was very highly successful, and it attracted all sorts of people: Japanese, Americans, Germans, and so on. They suddenly got this research project. It was a gas making project, and it was suddenly the most advanced in the world, and they were all interested. They wanted a sample of it, and we had umpteen visits from the top brass in the company and so on. And they decided that they needed somebody important to run the show rather than me, who was a research guy. And they brought in a general manager. Now, this general manager had been manager of a really rough works in Glasgow, and he wasn't used to dealing with research personnel and discussing things amicably and moving things along in a gentle sort of way. And he and I didn't hit it off. So I came back to Solihull, and when I came back to Solihull, the master at that time, it'll come to me in a minute. What was his name? Tom Warner, yeah, Tom Warner, and Vernon Green, who was a secretary, knocked on my door one night and said, "We'd like you to stand for Master of the Guild." Tom was resigning. We'd like you to stand. Bloody hell! I'm only a young kid, you know. I'm 37 or something. I think I was at the time. You know, we're not used to having masters of the guild at that sort of age. So I said no. Anyway, they came around again and explained why they wanted me to stand. And I found out that at that time, Brian Woolley was being put up for master, and there were various reasons why they didn't support him, shall we say. And so I agreed to stand as master, and he backed off and disappeared. And I became master of the guild. And we did lots of things in those days. John Illingworth was the secretary, and he and I devised all sorts of different things. Like, we split the guild into three. Communication was not good. We split the guild into three in the hope that we could get people to practice locally, and they did. That worked initially, anyway. It died out later for various reasons. We rewrote the constitution. What else did we do? Oh yeah. Oh yes, I remember. I organised it because I thought that a lot of the problems in the guild were relating to the way people were taught. They weren't being taught well enough, and they were, they were getting to a point where they could sort of handle a bell and then leaving. They weren't. Basically, I thought that they weren't being taught properly. So I said, we'll have a tower captains conference. It's the way we did things in those days. We had this tower captains conference, and I invited all the tower captains to a meeting at, I think it was in Knoll. And inevitably, all the tower captains that I thought were pretty competent turned up, and all those that I thought were crap did not turn up. I suppose it was fairly obvious and a stupid mistake to make, but there you are. You live and learn, don't you? So how are we doing? You want me to finish, or?
Well, I've had a question come in, which I think is an interesting question, as all questions are. And it links in well with what you've been talking about, actually. Obviously, you've seen ringing probably recover from low points over the years. Obviously, you talked about it with St Martin's Band as well, recovering in the sort of late 40s, early 50s, and perhaps some experience of the Guild as well. Do you have any thoughts on how we might recover from the current extended break?
No. Not really. I mean, I'm very impressed with what's being done, of course. I mean, I'm not involved in any of it, but all this electronic stuff is very impressive. How to recover from it? You think we presumably the thinking at the moment is that we're going to lose a lot of ringers. Well, my solution to teaching, retention of ringers or teaching is to teach them properly. And I think what's been done at the school has been very impressive, and I think that has been a world beater, in many respects. And the people that are coming out of that are pretty well retained. They haven't gone away. They don't feel when they start ringing changes that they could never do it, which is what most people who couldn't hand a bell thought. I don't have that much to offer in terms of other than that. I'm sorry.
John, I wondered if you had any thoughts on how things are different or similar with the Guild today compared to sort of the 1970s and 80s.
Oh, communication is the big thing, isn't it? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you've only got to look back at, ask the secretary to look back at the minutes and see how they were written in those days. And they'll see my handwritten minutes. And that's the way it was. And if I wanted to communicate, I used to have to send letters to people. I mean, there was no email or anything like that. So communication has improved no end. And of course, in the last 10 years, all these new systems have come online, and that has been the big transformation. Is definitely the ability to communicate with large numbers of people quickly, and that has helped a lot. What else? Yeah, I know that's sorry, I was going to go down another long avenue, but I think the time is short.
Just a couple of things. We've actually got the minute books from the Guild downstairs in the living room, actually, for the last 100 years or so. And I mean, they're fascinating, as you say, and I'm hoping at some point we're about to do a session one evening about the Guild minute books, which might sound quite dull on face value, but actually it's really, really interesting when you dig in between actually what was going on. Adam asks, if you could bring one more pill somewhere, in which tower would it be and which method?
One more peel? Oh. Well, it would have to be St Martin's, wouldn't it? It'd have to be step 6, I suppose. What else did you expect me to say? mean, I've rung that much Stedman sinks there. I don't think I could do anything else. Yeah, it would be. I mean, St Martin's has been my second home in many respects. I mean, I've been ringing there for over 60 years, and every I mean, it's difficult now for me not to turn up. And I stagger up the stairs and still get there. And I'm hoping, I'm trying to keep fit to the point where I shall be able to do it. But my ticker is not joining me too well. But there we are.
Yeah. John, I mean, like you, a little bit conscious about time, but equally, you know, in some ways, we've sort of only touched the surface of some of the things that you've done. And I'm kind of tempted to try and invite you back for part 2, where we can look at, you know, a bit more about the Guild and your experience with the Central Council and the 12-bell competition and perhaps tenor ringing. You know, so hopefully I'll be able to twist your arm to come back and do the latter part of things if you're willing. There's a couple more questions coming in, and I think I certainly agree with this. David Baverstock says, you've been very modest about your own career and achievements. He first heard of you by reputation as an excellent tenor ringer. Do you agree with that reputation? There's a chance to stop being modest.
How would I know? Good God. You don't answer that sort of question.
Yeah.
I've rung lots of heavy bells, that's true. Some badly, some reasonably well. Nothing special, I don't think, but there we are.
Yeah, lots and lots of thanks coming in, John, and lots of people saying, please come back for part 2. So I think we should, definitely put that in the diary if you're happy.
Well, there's a bit more, but whether there's an hour's worth is questionable. And I think. Anyway, thank you all very much for. Is there anybody there still?
Yes, everyone's still here, John. And
thank you all.
I know I did some staff training the other day, and you know, you're talking into a screen. It's very, very odd because you can't see the audience, and I know it feels odd, but I've been looking at people's faces, and people have been absolutely raptured in what you've been saying. You spin together a story, John. Spin together is the wrong word, but you put together a story so wonderfully that, you know, sometimes it feels. People say this about my lessons often, that time goes very slowly. But actually, you know, the last hour has just flown by with you, and, you know, you engage and sustain us so well. So thank you so much for coming along and putting that together. And, you know, I know there's plenty more for you to say. So lots and lots of thanks coming in. People loving hearing about, you know, ringers they'd heard about in the teenage years, and loads of people saying, please come back for part 2. So, you know, on behalf of the Guild and everyone here today, thank you very much. David Hull earlier on said he's sorry he had to go early, but he'll look forward to listening to the recording. And thank you for tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me, first of all, and I wish all of my talks would go as easily as this one has.
It's good when you've got a mute button, John. I'll just do a quick plug for next week. We are joined next week by Vicky Chapman from the Central Council, who's going to talk about public relations and again, thinking about some of the challenges we're facing at the moment in ringing. You know, obviously that might be or will be a very key area as we move, forward into the next year. So, you know, I hope people can join us for that at 7 o'clock as always. So Vicky Chapman from the Central Council.
Good. I can't wait to see Vicky Chapman.
Excellent, Susan. Good stuff. Right, I'll stop the recording now and shut up. I suspect that's probably a good moment for me to be quiet.